Hi everyone, I'm Zach Reinhardt, here to review the new Klan Aileen album. Klan Aileen. It's self-titled. Klan Aileen is a somewhat experimental post-punk band from Tokyo, Japan, and this is, I believe, their second album, though this is my first time listening to them. I don't really remember what prompted me to pick up this album. It came out in October and it slipped by me then, but then, like a month later, I think somebody was talking about it on Twitter and I decided to pick it up. I don't really remember, but whatever prompted me to pick this up, I'm glad because this is a pretty solidly enjoyable record. Getting into the album, it starts off with the song Hanarete, which is like a short little palate cleanser that comes at the beginning to kind of set you in the right mindset for the rest of the album. It starts off with these slow, deep, resonant, kind of spacey guitar chords and like very distant, kind of lo-fi drums and very like reverby, distant vocals that sound like they're being shouted from like across like a big kind of echoey room. The song is very soft and kind of cold and spacey. Everything is really kind of taking up a lot of space with how much it kind of reverberates in the mix. And it builds rather quickly into a bunch of synths and kind of resonant effects and such, and like deep kind of like drony bass synth that really like expands the song and makes it kind of psychedelic. It gets really dense and kind of cluttered, but not very noisy. It doesn't get like distorted or anything like that. And it just kind of goes as quickly as it comes on this strange chord that doesn't really resolve with the rest of the chord progression. The song is pretty enjoyable on its own. Like, it's got some nice, interesting sound play. And it's also just a nice intro track that really kind of sets up the rest of the record and gives you kind of an idea of what you're in for. The next song, Fog, starts up, and it's a bit more upbeat. It's a bit just kind of more tangible and less spacey and kind of awash with effects. It reminds me a bit of The Strokes, but like much more like depressed Strokes. You get the same kind of cold, distant, reverby vocals that are so kind of soft in the mix and kind of echoey that it's hard to really make out what any of the words are. After the first verse, the song starts to pick up a bit and it gets a bit louder and more distorted on the guitars. And it builds into this bridge which changes chord progressions into something that's not so kind of melancholy and is actually kind of uplifting for a little bit. And the vocals get a lot louder and higher in their register. He normally is doing this very kind of low, soft vocal delivery that really adds to a lot of the kind of melancholy atmosphere of a lot of these songs. And it really makes for a nice contrast for when he gets louder and more passionate in his vocal delivery. A distorted lead guitar comes in and does a guitar solo, and the song builds and builds and gets more kind of psychedelic as it goes on. But after the guitar solo, it comes to a end and gets much more spacey and transitions very nicely into the next track, Night Seeing, which is even faster and more upbeat and punkier and louder. Night Seeing is one of the few tracks on here that really reminds me that I'm listening to a contemporary Japanese post-punk band. It's loud, it's in your face, it's really kind of reminiscent of a lot of other Japanese punk and post-punk bands. I'm really reminded of Berg on this track and like older, early Yolts in the Sky as well. There's some really cool guitar work on this track and just really solid performances all around. My only complaint really about these tracks so far is they're a bit lo-fi, and it doesn't really work with how kind of spacey and like tranquil some of the tracks are. I often find myself wishing for higher production value. But writing wise and performance wise, these songs are really on point. Night Seeing proceeds to build even more in this loud, aggressive direction. It has some really just great like peaks and valleys. There's a lot of dynamics in how kind of loud and quiet this song gets. And it all flows like really, really well. And it's an awesome track. And all these first few tracks are really solid, with the exception of the production. And those production issues are brought even more into focus on the next track, Adrift, which starts off with these really spacey, kind of echoey guitar chords that actually peak on this song. Like there's actually some distortion for just how kind of loud they are in the mix. The song eventually kind of covers that up with just more instrumentation and getting louder and intentionally more distorted as it goes. But there's still definitely some just kind of production issues, and for how spacey and kind of psychedelic they're trying to go on some of these tracks, I just feel the lo-fi-ness doesn't really help, especially on the drums. The drums really kind of suffer from the production issues and not being recorded very well. But what they lack in the production department, they really make up for in writing and just gusto in their performance. There's a lot of just energy in every note played on these things, especially the drums. Like the drums are really saved by how well they're played. The track Shizukani Omowareru is a good example of this. There's just tons of cool like sound play and interesting like dynamics all over this track. It starts off with these kind of echoey, like looping, just guitar noodling and noise with very soft, kind of distant drums. And some of the effects and just like sound play they use reminds me a little bit of the band Nisen Nen Mondai. There's a lot of these kind of like staccato, like stuttering noises that are made over this bed of kind of spacey guitar sounds, and the vocals are there, but they're so kind of buried in the mix that the song almost just feels like an instrumental. There's this weird point where like trumpet comes in and starts being slightly jazzy over top of all the noise for just like a few seconds before disappearing. And the song slowly builds from being really spacey and psychedelic to being very noisy and distorted and just drenched in feedback, and like it almost becomes just like a harsh noise track for a little bit. There's just a ton of character that comes across in this song, and just how much sound play and kind of dynamics and how much the song just morphs from front to back. And then that kind of mind-bending, weird soundscape is contrasted by the track that follows it, Happy Memories, which is another one of the really kind of normal post-punk tracks on here. I'm reminded even more heavily of Berg on this song again. The song is fast-paced, it's punky, it's aggressive, and it's fun. It's just a lot of energy being thrown around, and there's just nothing to complain about. If you're into this kind of Japanese post-punk, like, this is just a really solid example of how it's done. And then skipping ahead a bit, we have Fascism, the final track on this album, and also the longest track by far at 7.5 minutes. But surprisingly, it manages not to waste any of that time. The song starts off, as many of these songs do, with slow, kind of spacey, echoey guitars and soft, distant vocals. But the song kind of throws in a left hook when it switches into like a more kind of just like a rock and roll riff that goes on for just a short time and builds into this big, distorted, I guess you could call it a chorus, that they revisit a couple times and then return back to this kind of slow, spacey groove that they built up at the very beginning. And when they do these like choruses with this big riff, like it triples the size of the song, it feels like. The song is really kind of subdued and soft before it suddenly kind of explodes into a bunch of energy and distortion and just gets really in your face for just like a few seconds. Like the song feels like bipolar. And as the song goes, it kind of gives in to that noisier, louder side. And you get these like high distorted lead guitars, and eventually like the spacey rhythm guitar throws on this brittle, like just abrasive distortion, and the song gets just huge and loud and noisy, just really noisy. It covers itself in feedback, and you get all sorts of like these effects in the background, and they bring in some synths, and the whole thing just gets really intense until the very end when it just kind of drops back into that spacey groove from the beginning. And overall, like it's just a really nice kind of peak and valley building song. It has some really great dynamics and it flows really well from front to back and manages to stay interesting and constantly kind of changing over its 7.5 minute runtime. Overall, it's a really solid track, and overall, this is a really solid album. My only real problem with it is the production. Like, it's just a bit too lo-fi with how kind of expansive they're trying to be. And those two kind of feelings collide a bit for me. But beyond that, like, I don't really have any complaints. Like, this is a pretty solid record. It's well written, it's well performed, and there's a lot of really great ideas being explored here and really kind of cool compositional elements. The album manages to stay pretty diverse in how its mood changes and how loud and quiet it gets, but doesn't give up any of the cohesion of the album as a whole. I've often kind of criticized albums for having like abrupt peaks and not being very well structured from front to back. But this album like is a textbook like example of how to do a well structured kind of cohesive experience from the beginning to the end of the album. The songs all sound different from one another, but all definitely sound like they're all part of the same project. Overall, I'm feeling an 8 out of 10. I don't really have any complaints other than the production. I just want to see Klan Aileen come back with a third album and it to be like just a little bit more produced. I don't want it overproduced. Just a little bit more to kind of allow them to explore this vast psychedelic territory that they're trying to explore. And I think we'll have a real solid winner on our hands if they manage to do that. But until then, that's me, and this is the new Klan Aileen record. It's self-titled, and yeah, it's pretty good. Check it out if you're into bands like Yoles in the Sky, bands like Berg, just generally kind of Japanese experimental rock and post-punk and such. Peace.